Okay, hello and welcome to this week's content in SOCO 3220 Youth Culture and Risk. And today we move into the kind of world of young people and work, but in a particular way. So I'm going to break it up into three sections. I'm going to start by talking about some very general understandings of the kind of labour market that young people face, and the way that it's kind of increasingly understood through the notion of precarity. And then I'm going to move on to kind of two case studies, I suppose, that look at aspects of this that I've been doing research on. And it's research that comes out of the same project that I was talking about previously, about the punk DIY scene across the east coast of Australia. So where in that stuff I was talking about kind of the cultural and struggles that happen within the scene about their work and about what they do. And about the meanings of, punk or the problems with gender relations. And the data that I'm going to focus on this week is the way that some young people in those scenes kind of set up a kind of job for themselves, or set up a business, or even set up a career within it. And then the second part, I'm going to talk a little bit about a different aspect of it where they, I suppose, use some of their punk ethics to then make decisions about careers in the broader parts of their lives, and in some ways almost choose to kind of opt out of the mainstream system, and in some senses then choose to be poor. So in terms of, to begin with, youth and precarity. It's well established now that young people face a really complex and uncertain labour market situation. Young people's unemployment rates are always way more than the general population, and if you look at it in even more detail, they kind of tend to be massively over-casualised labour and underemployed as well. So this all speaks into the kind of youth transitions literature that I've been talking about in the course, that engages with the kind of idea that transitions are getting longer, more complex, and that kind of thing. In terms of broader societal concerns, and that sociology kind of thinks about here, is that the idea that maybe that if there's a heap of precarity within that kind of, a transition to get a full-time job, this might lead to high incidence of alienation and exclusion, and particularly those from more disadvantaged backgrounds, it's likely to affect more. So at the same time, there's been the kind of a huge amount of research about the kind of formal pathways from school to work, from like high school to work or high school uni to work. But not so much for kind of young people that kind of opt out of that trajectory or do things in a different way. And that's definitely what I'm focusing on here today. So the work here speaks to the kind of rise of the very notion of the precariat. And this is around Guy Standing's work, who highlights there's kind of basically a rapidly increasing amount of people throughout the world that are living precariously in terms of their labour market position. Short-term contracts, casualised labour, underemployment is increasingly the norm. And importantly here, though, this is kind of rising up the class system, that even people that with well-qualified high qualifications, in that Borgesian sense, more economic, more cultural, more social capital, are also experiencing this precarity in ways that are very, very new. Beck and Furlong and Cartmore have written a paper on this in terms of youth studies, talk about this as being a kind of process of what they call Brazilianisation, where the global labour market is becoming more like Brazil has always been. In this sense, there's kind of, a kind of hollowing out of the middle class in many ways. So again, this links to kind of all kinds of globalisation processes that are kind of, I think, well encapsulated by the reflexivity modernity theorists that I was outlining earlier on in the course. So my concerns here in starting this project, those years ago, was kind of to think about this a little bit differently. As I said, there's a lot of research about these kind of youth transitions, but through my own kind of observations, I noticed there was kind of people in kind of the music scene in particular that were, doing kind of these kind of small subcultural entrepreneurial activities. These kind of things largely had escaped, I think, the attention of researchers, I suppose. So again, it points to the notion that there's all this kind of precarity and uncertainty going on in the labour market, and people deal with it in different ways. So there's certainly been all that collapse of the youth labour market, casualisation of the work of the labour market in general, and certainly upward credentialising. And as I've already pointed out, you can see some figures there from 5 years ago where the youth unemployment rate is double that of the general, and that's pretty much the norm. Quite often it's more than double. So the research that I'm kind of focusing on today shows that there's young people out there that are kind of manufacture their own pathways to work. And they do that because they want to do something in terms of what they're passionate about. And again, here you can think about this in terms of Bourdieu's notion of illusio. And they combine their leisure and creative practices and kind of blur the lines between leisure and work. And again, that's important to think about later in the course when we start talking about those new forms of labour, effective labour and immaterial labour. So I suppose this research is a way of thinking of kind of between the dichotomies of informal work and formal work, between employment, underemployment, and unemployment, and between the kind of categories of education, leisure, and work. Many of the young people that I'm talking about in this kind of fall outside some of the official categorizations that we're kind of used to in youth studies, and even in kind of more broader societal categorizations. So my research shows that there's kind of deliberate decisions to opt out of the kind of formal trajectories and try and do it in their own kind of creative, entrepreneurial way. And in a way, this is also a reaction to many of the kind of main opportunities that are offered to young people today in terms of the first jobs that they can have. There's a kind of almost universal acceptance now in the Western world that, young people just kind of have shitty jobs, and that's the normal thing. Jobs, where they're just kind of doing this kind of short-term, casual, often service labour type stuff. And again, that's only a relatively new thing over the past couple of decades. So in some ways you can see what's happening here as a way of strategizing away from those things. That's not to say that the people I'm talking to haven't had those jobs, but they want to kind of avoid those things as well. So the research wants to kind of think about why people do this. Is it sustainable economically? The answer to that is mostly not. So it's kind of very risky to kind of do this kind of stuff as well. And can these kind of grassroots forms of subcultural entrepreneurship be sustainable over longer periods of time? So in this way, these young people kind of start off being interested in, say, a music scene that I'm looking at here. They get involved in it. In the Borgesian sense, they build up some subcultural and cultural capitals, and they kind of turn that leisure practice into a kind of more serious hobby, and then some kind of turn it into a business or even a career. The lucky ones, or the kind of successful ones, at least can manage to kind of make it into the thing that they do for the rest of their lives. So I'm introducing the notion here of DIY careers, and there's a kind of term that's been developed among myself and some other colleagues across the world, Andy Bennett and others, and there's a special issue of cultural sociology that has a number of papers on the notion of DIY career and on different aspects of people around the world in different subcultures doing this kind of thing. So if you're interested in what I'm saying here, you should check that out. But I'm thinking here in terms of my work around Bourdieu, and thinking about the way that these are kind of ways of thinking about struggles and strategies that the young people take up in this kind of ever increasingly risky world. So in a way too, it's a kind of effort to bridge the gap between that kind of youth transitions and youth cultures stuff, where those things were largely, I suppose, researched separately. And we can see in this kind of the findings of this research that we need to actually consider those things more in a unitary way, because the way that people make decisions aren't just about work or just about creativity or leisure. They tend to kind of build up their habitus by taking part in those things over time, and therefore they start to make decisions, for instance, about their career maybe through the lens of a punk ethos. So again, you can think about this in terms of motivations and values, illusio, the way people want to invest themselves into things to make their lives meaningful and livable. And this is certainly, I think, a good example of young people trying to do that outside of, the mainstream kind of, rat race version of a career.